Here's a YouTube question from one of our listeners named Patrick. He says, what does the Bible say about the death penalty?
Yeah, and there are all sorts of, well, this is just a great question because there are all sorts of debates that are happening about the death penalty, about whether it's legitimate, whether it should ever be exercised. A couple things here that I'll say. One, there were capital crimes in the Old Testament. I mean, God's people, during the time of the theocracy in Israel, the civil law that he gave to them, there were crimes, sins that could be committed that would result in death, where you were liable to this judgment, to capital punishment. And so you do see it in Scripture. And also when we come to the New Testament specifically, it seems to me like when the Apostle Paul talks about the civil government and those authorities, that he says they do exercise the sword. And right there, it seems like he's referring again to capital punishment. And it doesn't seem like he's talking about it in a sense that, they're doing so illegitimately, but that this is just a part of what they do in terms of the carrying out of justice in society. I'm thinking of Romans chapter 13, where Paul says in verse 1, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain." And so this seems like the Apostle Paul is just talking about how things were at that time, and he's encouraging, essentially, right? We want to be people who live in ways that are in line ultimately with God's law, and doing good in society. And when we don't, when we break laws, and especially very serious ones, right, we're subject or we're liable to judgment. Now, it's interesting because in the Old Testament, God made it very clear that an individual who was subject to capital punishment, you couldn't be punished in this way except on the basis of eyewitness testimony. You couldn't even be one witness; it had to be multiple witnesses. And so there was this attempt, if you will, to safeguard, as you can imagine, the judicial process. And so, what I'll say is it's clear in Scripture that capital punishment was practiced both in Israel under the Old Covenant, and it seems like it's one of the things that civil government does. But that's not to say at all that the way it's practiced all the time today is always right. And in fact, we've seen, there have been stories of instances, tragically, where an individual is wrongly accused or they're punished and they were innocent. And so this is something that requires a lot of wisdom. And I think the Scriptures do have wisdom for us here in this area. But it's also something that just having to deal with this question, right? This is not how the world that God made is supposed to be. I think of the words that Jesus speaks to the religious teachers when they're asking him about divorce, and he says, from the very beginning, it wasn't supposed to be like this. But there are these things that we do because of your hardness of heart, because of sin. And so, having this discussion, talking about these, the reason we have to talk about these things is because of sin, because of the fallenness of the world. We know that in the new creation, this isn't going to be a reality. It's something that we're not going to look at anymore. And I think that's important for us to take into consideration as well. And so appreciate that question. And again, those are a couple passages of Scripture that you might want to dig into a little bit further.